Stein was there, there was actually in the up until relatively recent times, there was actually a building there referred to as the AOH Hall. And again, that was called the Ancient Order of Hibernians. That will probably get you an A if we can kind of hold on to that, because we're going to get your exam papers on a moment. Luke has been waiting all night to hand out the test papers. He's going to get his chance now. If I call you one more time. Luke, are you about? And before that was actually a primary school. So, I mean, we've been mentioning that the nuns and brothers came in the 1860s and so on, but there was actually 4 or 5 primary schools, well, elementary schools, used was like head schools. You've got to be very, very careful of your language you use, because primary schools is not what it was meant then, or a secondary school and so on. It's a completely different concept. But there would have been schools for the elementary teaching of youngsters to give on the basics of reading and writing, because you're now becoming into a society, becoming a little bit more complex. And you are giving people 2 very basic skills to be able to read literature, and you also had to give them basic skills around certain amount of maths, because people had to understand things like timetables to do with railway stations and so on. The railways brought in the clocks, by the way. Clocks wasn't important until the railways came in. And once the railways came in, then you had things called schedules, and people had to understand there was an 8 o'clock and a 9 o'clock and so on. The catalyst for clocks was the railways. And in the same way, for example, the schools where the catalyst at the time was getting people to read and write. So define education. What do you mean by this? It's an interesting concept. And then later on then expanded to do other things, which was to do with certain amount of histories and geographies and so on. And there was also reasons why they were introduced. But there was a school there. Now what's interesting as well is that there was always a little uneasy relationship. Somebody said to me a while ago, I'm giving a very sanitized version of the story of Doon. I am giving a sanitized version because I'm being very politically correct, but now we won't be too politically correct for a moment. There was a little bit of, right, this guy here might get excited in the car. He would divide it. But there was a little bit of a tension between the idea that the brothers had around education and the idea some of the priests had around education. And I know that Pat Duggan is here tonight because it was an uncle of Pat. Pat, we're talking about your uncle, about the priest here. Pat's uncle. There was a Father Duggan here, and he had his own views in education. So for a short time, there were 2, shall we say, secondary schools in the little place. In this town, of course it was a town, a big place, wasn't it? So Father Duggan had his own school here in the AOH Hall. He was a sort of not getting on that well with the brothers at the time, who had their own secondary school at the time. So for a short time, there was 2 schools, but and when I say secondary schools, he had probably 7 or 8 pupils. There was probably 10 or 15 or 20 above at the brothers, because it wasn't secondary education. That didn't come in here until about 1910, and it was very small at the time. In actual fact, there's a story told that there was only really 1 class. They were all piled into 1 class, 25 or 30 guys. And in 1919, 1920, there was a story told by a man called Stapleton, Gerald Stapleton, about one of the guys, they couldn't get him to stop coughing. He was always coughing in the class, and everybody was getting quite irritated. Why was he coughing? He had come back from the First World War. He was a mature student. He had been gassed. So he was only a guy, he was only 19 or 20 anyway, because if we look at the casualty ages, should I suppose, they're only 16, 17, 18. So he'd served in the First World War. He'd come back to school to better himself. He's inside in what we now call first year, for the want of a phrase, and he's coughing all the time because he had been gassed.